Good morning. Appreciate you all getting up bright and early to be here for the kickoff here on Friday morning. I'm going to run my timer so I make sure we've got time for questions at the end. So, my name is Amy Shuart. I'm the head of North America Government Affairs for Onfido. Prior to joining Onfido, I spent about 15 years on Capitol Hill and in federal agencies. So, come at this from a perspective of a Washington insider. So look forward to chatting with you about this today. I think most folks that come to a conference like this know what synthetic identity fraud is, but just in case this is not on your radar, this is the definition provided by the U.S. Federal Reserve. Ultimately, synthetic identity is the use of personal identifiable information to fabricate an individual. And and in order to commit a dishonest act for personal or financial gain. So how do you create a synthetic identity? So thinking about identity broadly, you've got traditional identity fraud, which we're all used to, that the perpetrator is actually just impersonating someone. And so they use their PII and they use it to access, to open a line of credit or to do something else with their identity. There's, of course, legitimate use where a person is taking their name, their social security number, they're trying to open an account. And then there's synthetic identity fraud. And the challenge here is that the perpetrator is taking a fake name and they're adding it with other fake identifying information, and they're using a social security number and they're creating a synthetic ID. At its core, what they're doing is they're taking advantage of the fact that in the US, we have very much a knowledge-based authentication type approach to identity, where we rely heavily on credit bureaus and credit bureau files. And so what they're able to do is be able to take any social security number, and if that social security number is not in a credit bureau's file, and they're able to open an account with a social security number and a name, they can establish a line of credit. This is certainly something this is not for the fraudster that doesn't have any patience, because synthetic IDs are something that you need to grow over time. So they will open an account somewhere where they didn't have to do any KYC, and then from there, they'll keep growing it to the point that they're able to open a credit card, take out a loan, and then they'll just disappear because there's no person behind the identity. So thinking about this broadly and from an identity provider, verification provider perspective, this is a really scary attack vector, in part because of what we've been talking about all week with AI and the advances in technology. So they're going to take this synthetic information, this synthetic identity, they can attach it to a fake document with fake biometrics. It's a lot easier these days to make both a fake document and a fake biometric, and they can use that to do synthetic identity fraud, or they can pair a fake document with their own real biometrics so that way they don't have to worry about doing the selfie match portion with fake biometrics. Again, it's still a synthetic identity fraud, but it's a little more like an imposter in that situation. The global impact of synthetic identity fraud is a lot. So what you see here is there are just a lot of different reasons why someone might make a synthetic identity, whether it's money laundering, human trafficking, credit, trying to get a bank account or a loan, terrorism to launder that money to commit acts in the payment space, and fraud just in general. So there's just a lot of different things at play here that makes synthetic identity fraud really important. So how big of a deal is this? So the best stats we have out there is there's estimated by Fiverity that there's $20 billion in estimated losses to synthetic identity fraud. This is a pretty big number, and I think one of the challenges here is that that's $20 billion that businesses have lost. It's not $20 billion that individuals have lost. So unlike a regular traditional identity fraud scheme, you're not impersonating anyone. So it doesn't necessarily hurt me that you've created a synthetic ID with my social security number unless I'm going to try to establish a line of credit in the future and that my identity's already taken. Synthetic identities account for about 85% of fraud right now, according to the Federal Trade Commission. So this is a huge attack vector that's just growing because it's easy for fraudsters to do. And the average amount that they're stealing before a synthetic identity is found is roughly $100,000. So it's a decent chunk of change for the amount of work that they're putting into this. In order to prevent against a synthetic identity, you really have to deploy a layered approach to fraud prevention. It's not enough to do document verification, because if the document is a good fake, okay, we don't know. So you've got to verify that that document is actually belongs to a person. So the attribute validation is really important on that driver's license. From there, you've got to say, okay, does the person match the document? So the classic selfie match type of verification is really important. But as we talked about, you can have fake biometrics and a fake document associated with a synthetic identity. So from there, you're going to make sure you do some data verification. Those government attribute databases are really important. And then you also need to make sure there's the passive fraud detection. So layering signals behind that, whether that's geolocation or IP address, all of these things have to come together in order to combat synthetic identity fraud. So ultimately, kind of thinking big picture, this was a quote from the National Cybersecurity Strategy that was published earlier this year. And what's notable here is this is one of the first times that we're really seeing the U.S. federal government get serious about identity fraud and how we go about combating it. So today, the lack of secure, privacy-preserving, consent-based digital identity solutions allow fraud to flourish. It perpetuates inequity and adds inefficiency. Operating independently, neither the private sector nor the public sector have been able to solve the problem. At its core, this is really important because in this room, we're not going to be able to do it alone as an industry. We're going to have to work with government. Government can't do it without us. And so it's great to see the White House acknowledging this. But then the question is, how are we going to move forward? So what's the role of governments in stopping synthetic identity fraud? I would urge you to read the Office of Management and Budget's, it's M1917. So this is their enabling mission delivery through improved identity, credential access, and management. If you just Google M1917, you'll be able to find it on the internet. This was published back during the Trump administration, and where they said, for the very first time, agencies are authoritative sources for attributes, like the Social Security number, and these are used for identity proofing events. And these agencies shall establish privacy-enhanced data validation APIs for public and private sector identity proofing services based on consent. This is a really big deal in Washington, D.C., because what this is saying is that federal agencies have a role in identity proofing. If you talk to a federal agency like the Social Security Administration and you say, you have a role here, the Social Security number is at the core of people's identity in America, they will smile at you and then they will tell you that their job is to get the right check to the right person at the right time, that they are not an identity agency. And so what this direction from the Office of Management and Budget did was it said to agencies, that may not be your core mission, but you absolutely have a role to play here. And so this is a really important step in the right direction. I also want to highlight here, based on consumer consent. That's a really important piece here too, because it's not that we're going to be able to look at government databases and just be able to check it in the background. Consent is going to be key, but consent is also what's going to make this challenging, because as we've seen with the one government attribute validation service that's been stood up, it can add a lot of friction. And government agencies get very nervous about what that consent language has to be and how you approach it. So the government's first identity attribute validation service is eCBSV, which was created by the Social Security Administration. For those of you who are familiar with SSA's services, you might know that they, for years, have what's called CBSV, which is the consent-based Social Security verification system. The challenge there is it was a paper-based system, wet signature, sending that form in order to get the data checked. That doesn't work in the modern environment. And so industry came to Social Security Administration and said, we need a real-time electronic signature-based system. And SSA said, that's nice, not our problem. So what industry had to do was go to the Congress and make the case. I was on Capitol Hill when eCBSV was first talked about. And one of the things that was really interesting here was that it's a great example of what is the challenge with working with the federal government. So they came and had a meeting, the industry did, and said, we have this problem. We have synthetic identity fraud. We cannot stop it. We need access to SSA's data in real time. We say, okay, tell me more. And then they start talking about, oh, well, there's $200 billion of fraud. It's hurting our company's bottom line. It's 85% of attacks. And then you say, but who does it hurt? And when industry says no one, it's hard to get Congress to pay attention to that when they're focused on individuals and not necessarily on the business community. The other challenge here was that in order to get this system stood up, you had to go to what was called the Ways and Means Committee that is in charge of the Social Security Administration, your taxes, some of your health care. They're not in charge of the financial services system. So having banks come in and say, we have a problem, again, very nice, but let me introduce you to my friends at the Financial Services Committee who said, oh, this is a real problem, but I can't tell SSA what to do. So we really had a big challenge with the way that the government was set up to create this thing. Once it did finally get passed into law, we've seen that we've had several challenges. One is that it's limited to the financial services industry. As I mentioned, the Ways and Means Committee, this is not their core work, so they weren't the ones that led the charge. In order to get this act enacted into law, the Financial Services Committee had to put it in their jurisdiction, so something that they're supposed to work on. So they limited it to the financial services industry. That causes a real challenge because it limits the number of times you can check the system. There's also a lack of transparency on matching logic. For any electronic system, I don't know about you, but when I do type things on my phone, sometimes I fat finger things, and I don't necessarily even type my own name right. Any Shuart seems to show up more times than I care to admit. But if I was to type that in for something that's going to ping ECBSV, it's going to come back and SSA is going to say no match. They're not going to say, oh, she got one of the letters wrong in her name, and so the fuzzy logic information is just not there. That makes it a real challenge to use the system because you're not able to know exactly what you're getting back. It's just yes, no, dead. That's all you get. And then it's incredibly expensive. Again, this really comes back to this piece of legislation and the creation of this system because ECBSV was created with the understanding that industry was going to pay for this thing. But this is not Social Security's core job. It's not something they care a lot about. And being a longtime watcher of that agency, they're not always great at IT projects. And so this is a classic case of government overrun on a system that's become very expensive. How expensive, you might ask? So the agency charges users based on tiers. So they'll say up to 20,000 checks, they're going to charge you a certain amount. When this system started, for 20,000 checks, let me make sure I get this number right, it was going to cost annually $14,300. Okay, not bad, reasonable. You can probably sell that. However, due to cost overruns, due to the lack of use of the system and the fact that the agency has to get their money back from industry, they're raising their prices. The prices that they just published for 200,000 checks, $130,000 a year. Huge price increase from $14,000 in checks. If you're a large vendor and you're trying to use ECBSV, so let's say you're doing up to 20 million checks a year, your price has jumped from $276,500 to a cool $6.25 million annually to use the system. So you can understand why a lot of folks are just not using ECBSV. Kind of switching gears a little bit, this isn't attribute validation services are not a unique problem for the federal government. It's also something that state governments are able to provide through AMVA. So, but the challenge here is that state DMV participation varies across the country. And if you look at this map, you've got a couple shades of green there. So the dark green, those are the states that you absolutely can ping AMVA's database and be able to tell, is the data on the driver's license correct? However, for those lighter shades of green, the slightly darker light is SSA only. So the Social Security Administration, because they were trying to bring Social Security card online, replacement cards online, have been working with state governments to say, we need attribute validation services. Irony should not escape any of us in this room. But the problem is that some states are like, well, you know what? Only SSA can do this. We'll do it for you. We're not doing it for anyone else. That's a problem. Or other states are saying, okay, we'll do it for SSA and we'll do it for other government entities, but we're not going to do it for the private sector. That completely conflicts with what we just saw in the National Cybersecurity Strategy that says the private sector and the government have to work together to solve this problem. So as an industry, we're going to need to talk to states and talk about why this is so important. And when you think about identity proofing, being able to check the authoritative source is critical for 863. And so without AMVA, for states like California, we're relying on passports because we can't use driver's licenses. And I don't have to tell folks in this room about the friction that that causes, because I don't know how many people actually carry around their passport and easily are able to get it. You know, that driver's license, it should be in your pocket, or hopefully in some cases on your phone. But this is a real challenge, and so this is going to be a place where industry is really going to have to start talking about, from a national cybersecurity strategy perspective, how we need states to be partners. And it shouldn't escape you that SSA was the one that started pushing some of these agencies. So it is possible to push state governments, but we've got to figure out how to talk to them about this. So where do we go from here? There is a piece of legislation out there called the Improving Digital Identity Act of 2023. I'm not going to stand up here and tell you that the Improving Digital Identity Act is going to solve the identity industry's problems. It's not. At its core, what it is a task force that says, look, we need to get the federal government, state governments, local governments, anybody that has a stake in the identity space and industry in a room. And let's talk about what's going on with the digital identity infrastructure in the US and how we can improve it. The good news is that on Capitol Hill, now that we've seen what happened with pandemic unemployment insurance and how we've had rampant fraud in that program, the estimates are outrageous. They're starting to understand the differences here. We also know that we had state actors who were part of what went after the pandemic unemployment insurance issues. So that's also important, because it's able to tell a story on Capitol Hill, because it's not just people that are being affected, now it's taxpayer dollars. And that's certainly a way to get some folks' attention. But this task force is definitely a really important first step, and one that I'm excited to see. So the outlook for this bill, they got close last Congress. We were able to get it passed through committee in the Senate. The House was the holdup. The Senate is starting to move again, led by Senator Lummis and Senator Sinema as a bipartisan piece of legislation. They've already moved it through committee. The question is, where can it hitch a ride? And so this will be something that industry groups really need to do. So for those of you that come from companies that have a policy team or a government affairs shop, I really encourage you to go back to them and ask them, are you paying attention to this? Because this is important. And see what they're doing. What trade associations are they engaging with? And are those trade associations talking to people on the Hill about this problem? If they're not, and it's important to your business, they need to be. But government affairs folks are only as good as the internal teams who talk to them. So if you take nothing else from this talk, please go find your government affairs team and talk to them. So with that, happy to take any questions. Okay. All right. Well, folks, you can find me after.